Welcome to Chapter 14, Feeding the World, and I know it's the end of the semester and the last chapter in the book, but this is an amazing chapter and so important in all of our discussions about nutrition. We've talked about the micronutrients, the macronutrients, the dietary guidelines. We've gone into vitamins and minerals, and through the different stages of nutrition through infancy, childhood, adulthood, and advancing age, and then even into the safety of food and the production and distribution of food. And now we really need to look at some of the global and local issues of food consumption and sustainability. We're hearing so much about that word, sustainability, of the world's food and water resources, and this is of concern to all. So this is a really important chapter. We know that a large part of the world's population faces undernutrition and starvation on a daily basis. And this can lead to a plethora of public health issues. We know that other problems as far as the world societies can be too rich a diet, leading to overnutrition, obesity, and a different but equally dangerous and costly set of public health issues. So we need to really look at food production and distribution in populations and how sensible these are, and nutrition objectives, and global and local and national economic and political interests that affect these nutrition conditions around the world. So I know we've mentioned it previously that there really are two phases of malnutrition. One is undernutrition. That's the one you probably hear more about, which is hunger. And for most of us, the image that comes to mind when we think of malnutrition around the world is hunger and starvation. We see images on the television about starving children, deaths of children under the age 5. We see health organizations struggling with issues of undernutrition and illnesses around the world from hunger and starvation. And now overnutrition is becoming a global issue. The overweight and the undernourished both suffer from malnutrition, and they both experience high levels of sickness and disability. This gives us, both for over and undernutrition, shorter lifespans, reduced levels of productivity, and all kinds of chronic diseases. And these are complicated issues to address worldwide. So what are some impacts of undernutrition in the world? Well, in populations where chronic hunger is a problem, there's usually a cycle of undernutrition, and these can be country populations, community populations, or global populations. But the cycle begins when women who can't consume a nutrient-dense diet during pregnancy, they're more likely to give birth to low birth weight infants that are susceptible to illnesses and early death. And this causes a high infant mortality rate or a high infant death rate. And these are indicators of a population's health and their nutritional status. In most industrialized countries, though, infant mortality rates are less than 7 per about 1,000 live births, but in developing countries or communities, this can be over 50 per 1,000 live births. So we know that undernutrition causes these low birth weight babies. affects infant mortality rate. We see higher risks of infections, and infectious diseases are more common in undernourished children, and they may die of these infectious diseases that typically well-nourished children, they wouldn't be life-threatening. Also, we see stunting in undernutrition in children. This causes stunting or a low height for age, a low growth, which is an indicator of the nutritional health of a population's children. And stunting in childhood produces smaller adults who have a reduced work capacity and are unable to contribute to their society's economic and social development. Stunted and undernourished women are more likely than others to give birth again than to low birth weight babies. And so this becomes an issue for populations. In addition, abdominal obesity in adulthood is more common in those who have experienced lower birth weight and early childhood stunting, and this increases their population's risk of death from cardiovascular disease and hypertension and diabetes. So here we see the cycle of malnutrition and the low weight gain, not enough calories in women. It happens with the infants and then children's and adolescents, and it's just a cycle that keeps populations in this impaired health and productivity at every stage of life. Additionally, the cycle of malnutrition causes death in neonates and children under the age 5 from non-communicable diseases, injuries, neonatal deaths, respiratory diseases, diarrheal disease, and malaria, and other infectious diseases that healthy children normally can withstand. But overnutrition, so what we're seeing now is the number of overnourished people exceeds the number of undernourished people in the world, and by 2030, almost 60% of the world's population will be overweight or obese. And the prevalence of overweight and obesity, as we can see, is also growing in children. And why do undernutrition and overnutrition often exist in side-by-side, same communities, same populations? Because diets and lifestyles change as economic conditions improve. So we call this term the nutrition transition. And that is when a series of changes in diet, physical activity, health, and nutrition occurs as poor countries become more prosperous. So what happens is they have a decreased low birth weight babies and infant mortality. It increases their life expectancy, but they have an increased risk of chronic diseases and an overuse or an increased use of their natural resources. So let's talk a little bit more about diet or nutrition transition. So normally in developing countries and rural areas, there's limited foods, limited number of starchy grains. They consume more root vegetables. And in developed countries, in urban areas where, we're seeing McDonald's and fast food places move into, big third world cities, the population likes the increased variety. They have more meat in their diet. They have an increased availability of these low nutrient dense foods, and they're, doing a different kind of work. Their decreased outdoor and physical activity is starting to happen. So you can see a transition from these rural diets that were low fat, low sugar, high fiber. They were monotonous with little variety, and that could cause some nutritional deficiency, and they were mainly complex carbohydrates, not always. And sometimes this caused inadequate energy and or nutrients, and they had diseases and lack of medical care leading to undernutrition. And as they crossed that nutrition transition from an adequate and prudent diet to a more affluent diet that's high in fat, high in sugar, low in fiber, increased diversity, but it's high in animal proteins, and we know that that can increase our risk of saturated fats and some of these unhealthy fats. They become more inactive, smoking, alcohol, stress, and this leads to overnutrition and chronic diseases such as obesity, coronary artery disease, diabetes, hypertension, and stroke. So what are some of the causes of hunger around the world? So in situations where people lack adequate physical, social, or economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious foods that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life, what we see, and you can see it in our own communities, is inequitable food distribution. And these are the results in shortage of wrong combinations of foods to meet their needs. But the situation in turn can result in protein, energy malnutrition, and individual nutrient deficiencies. So that becomes a problem. I see that in a lot of the end of the term projects. And if you think about your own diet, you become more reliant on convenience food, and you can actually become malnourished. You're eating plenty of calories, but it's low in fiber and some of the micronutrients that are essential, and in the long term can lead to chronic diseases or nutritional deficiencies in our own diets. So food shortages, let's talk about those. So the most obvious example of a food shortage is a famine, and that's droughts, floods, earthquakes, and crop destruction due to disease or pests, or natural causes of famine. And human causes include wars and civil conflicts. So we can see that in Syria and some of these places where we have refugees, and there's a widespread lack of food access resulting from disasters. And food shortages due to famine are very visible because they cause many deaths in an area during the shortage period. But chronic food shortages take a greater toll, and chronic shortage occurs when economic inequities result in lack of money or healthcare and education for individuals or populations, and when the population outgrows the food supply, or when cultural and religious practices limit food choices, or when environmental damage limits the amount of food that can be produced. So here in this picture, we can see many survivors of the earthquakes in Haiti lived in those makeshift camps like this one, and the natural disaster destroyed their infrastructure that once distributed food throughout the country. So some of the regions had barely enough food to survive under normal conditions, are now, vulnerable to famine. And this situation is analogous to a man standing on water up to his nostrils. If it's calm, he can breathe, but if there's a ripple, he'll drown. A ripple such as a natural or civil disaster reduces the margins of survival and creates famine. So let's talk a little bit about poverty. We know that 21% of people around the world live below the international poverty line, and they earn less than $1.25 per day. And poverty is central to the problem in hunger and undernutrition. And in addition to creating food insecurity, poverty reduces access to health care, increases our prevalence of disease and disability. And when diseases go untreated, nutrient needs are increased, and a situation that further limits the ability to obtain an adequate diet and contributes to malnutrition. So those who are poorer also have less access to education, and this lack of access contributes to undernutrition and disease and reduces opportunities for them to escape poverty. And lack of education about food preparation and storage can affect food safety and the health of the household. And unsanitary food preparation increases the incidence of GI diseases, which contribute to malnutrition and even death. And here we see the regions of the world where poverty is the most prevalent. The map corresponds to the regions where there are the greatest number of undernourished people. In developing countries where 1 in 4 people subsist on less than $1.25 a day, account for about 98% of the world's undernourished people. And in wealthy countries, hungry people can usually obtain help to get food or money or to buy food. But in poor countries, a family that cannot grow enough food or earn enough money to buy food